British Prime Minister Keir Starmer arrived in China this week with a large delegation of business people and cultural figures. He received a warm welcome from host Xi Jinping. But the visit got a frosty reception from the White House. US President Donald Trump calling the trip dangerous. But why and how important was this visit? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The charm was in full flow from both sides for the visit of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to China. The first British leader in 8 years on Chinese soil got the warmest of welcomes, marking a significant thaw in the icy relations. A football presented by Starmer, signed by the Arsenal and Manchester United teams, revealed Xi to be a United fan, showing he's as read in sport as well as politics. But on the real business at hand, rather than on full display, big divisions on matters like the war in Ukraine and human rights were kept firmly behind closed doors in talks between the two. Spoiling the cordial atmosphere from afar was US President Donald Trump, who called the visit dangerous. So, how significant was this trip for both the UK and China? Is it a sign of more global realignment driven by Donald Trump's unpredictable policies, or just diplomatic business as usual? We'll discuss all that with our guests shortly, but first, a report from Alexandra Byers.
There are still months of winter to go in China, but diplomatically, a thaw is well underway. A warm welcome for UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer this week, the first British leader to visit China in 8 years. It's the latest in a slew of visits to the Chinese capital. Leaders from France, South Korea, Canada and Finland have come calling, and Germany is due next month. Starmer spent almost 3 hours with the Chinese president. He's hoping to attract new investment and says the UK wants a more sophisticated relationship with Beijing.
We had a very good, productive session with real concrete outcomes, and it was a real strengthening of the relationship, and that's in the national interest because, of course, there are huge opportunities here in China. It's the second biggest economy in the world, and that's why we've got such a big business delegation.
The teams ultimately signed 10 agreements covering areas like trade, illegal migration, and healthcare. They agreed to reduce import taxes on UK whiskey and announced visa-free travel for British citizens.
China is willing to develop a long-term, stable and comprehensive strategic partnership with Britain, which will benefit the people of both countries and also the world. Your visit has attracted a lot of attention. The road to success is often strewn with setbacks.
The visit's been criticized by opposition parties in the UK, among others, with concerns over Chinese espionage and its human rights record, including the jailing of British national and pro-democracy advocate Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, and the treatment of the largely Muslim Uyghur minority group. Starmer defended this visit, saying the UK can't afford to ignore the economic opportunities in China. He never mentioned the US president, but Donald Trump's tariff threats are the background to all these visits, as more and more nations decide to pivot away from the US. Trump's warned the UK against getting closer to China and threatened 100% tariffs after Canada signed a strategic partnership with Beijing earlier this month.
Well, it's very dangerous for them to do that, and it's even more dangerous, I think, for Canada to get into business with China. Canada is not doing well. They're doing very poorly, and you can't look at China as the answer.
These comments come ahead of his own planned visit to China, expected in April. And yet, for many countries, dealing with China may now be the more straightforward option, with Beijing portraying itself as the stable and reliable partner in an increasingly turbulent world. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Will Hutton is a political economist and author of The Writing on the Wall, China and the West in the 21st Century. He joins us from London. Andy Mock is Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for China and Globalization. He joins us from Beijing. And Steve Tsang is director of the China Institute at SOAS University of London. He joins us from Nottingham in the United Kingdom. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you all. Well, let's start with you. Was this trip really about resetting Britain's relationship with China, or perhaps more about hedging against President Trump's economic nationalism and the strategic uncertainty we're seeing emanating from Washington?
Bit of both. I think as Sir Keir Starmer said, you can't ignore the second biggest economy in the world. They have industrial capacity in all 419 of the product categories defined by the United Nations across industry. They aim for completion dominance in all 419, and they're likely to get it in a whole bunch of frontier areas. You can't do business unless you do business with China. They dominate, for example, the entire supply chain for anything to do with solar power. So, you can't ignore this country. Equally, what Trump has done, has made it more obvious that a kind of middle country like Britain should hedge its bets by having trade relationships with China, which are already quite significant. The trouble is, as I'm sure we'll kind of flush out in this discussion, that simultaneously, China is, as we speak, a large kind of navy is gathering in the South China Seas, threatening Taiwan. Cyber threats abound. Its economy, although strong, is simultaneously got all kinds of structural weaknesses. The over-reliance on bank debt, which now is 3 times Chinese GDP, to kind of finance this extraordinary kind of industrial strength it's got. Lots of non-performing loans, a precarious banking system, and a population that needs to be tightly controlled because it's restive. So it's kind of, it's both things, necessary because of Trump, necessarily because it's so big, but necessarily wary because China has strong interests of its own, which it's not unnaturally anxious to pursue, and pursues very single-mindedly.
Andy, what do you make of what you've just heard? From Beijing's perspective, what does China really want from its relationship from Britain? Was this a reset? Does it want market access, strategic legitimacy, technological cooperation? Or is it about geopolitical signaling, perhaps, towards Washington and Brussels?
Well, thanks for having me on, Adrian. I think from China's perspective, what it wants from the relationship with the UK is no different from what it wants with every other country, and that is mutual respect, respect for sovereignty, and a collaborative effort towards building sustainable global prosperity. Now, that being said, I think what we have to understand in this latest iteration of, or this latest chapter of China-UK relations, is that the story doesn't really start in Beijing. It doesn't start in London even, but it actually starts in Davos with Mark Carney's speech. And I think what this speech indicated is what Carney said publicly is what Western elites are saying in private, that, you really have to deal with China, not from a moral perspective, from, whatever the Western assumptions are about what morality is, but it is too large, too important technologically, diplomatically, to treat as an outlier or an exception. And language has to precede policy change. So the UK, now that this rhetorical space has opened in the Western world, the UK, I think, could not afford to be the first, but it certainly cannot afford to be the last. So as a fast follower, I think Starmer's visit, again, bringing this large delegation of business and cultural representatives is indicating that it really has to be a part of this new alignment. And I think this is going to have enormous repercussions, not just for the bilateral relationship, but China's relationship with, the Five Eyes, right? Because the UK is not a European middle power, and in fact is deeply embedded in the U.S. Security architecture. So I think this is going to present some very, very acute contradictions that the UK is going to have to face, as we've heard with President Trump's warning or threat about what the UK and Canada should do vis-a-vis China.
Steve, what do you make of all of that? If this visit was meant to be a reset, what did Keir Starmer actually come back with beyond symbolism and atmospherics? There was what? There were whiskey tariffs, visa-free travel, the deal with the investment from the pharmaceutical firm AstraZeneca, but very little else.
Well, first of all, the reset was political rhetoric on the part of the Prime Minister. If you look at the actual change in the relationship, I think we are seeing nothing more than the UK putting its relationship with China back on an even keel, nothing more than that. There is no fundamental strategic realignment or change in the UK relationship with China. The structural factors have not actually changed. The deals that the Prime Minister is bringing back home are very, very modest, as it was expected to begin with. But was that important? Yes, it was important, because the UK wanted to have good working relationship with China. The UK is a country with a strong record in diplomacy in a very pragmatic way. And diplomacy is not only for friends. Diplomacy is absolutely needed when we are dealing with non-friends. And at the moment, whether UK and China are friends or are simply not engaged in rivalry and competition is something that we need to explore. I think saying that we are now good friends is overstating it. President Trump is responding in the usual President Trump way. If he is talking about danger, what dangers does all these agreements Starmer brings to the UK have for the UK's national security or economic security or stability? Nothing. The risk, the danger was in UK making President Trump unhappy by having this visit before Trump has his own visit. And we should also bear in mind that the timing of the visit was decided perhaps ultimately by the timing for the approval of the mega embassy in London. If that embassy had not been approved by the UK government, I don't think the Prime Minister would have got the same reception he had in Beijing.
Will, what do you make of that? On this issue of Trump saying that it's dangerous for Britain to do business with China, is he right? Or is Britain simply adjusting to a multipolar world where blind loyalty to Washington is just no longer sustainable? I mean, you've long argued, that Britain needs a more sophisticated economic strategy towards China. Is it just simply a case of Britain simply needing China more than China needs Britain right now?
There are areas where I think China, doesn't need Britain, but I mean, there's benefits in a relationship with Britain that I think could accrue to China. But I mean, you're right. I mean, Donald Trump and the Carney speech have kind of what happened in Minneapolis have kind of crystallized kind of opinion, kind of not only in Britain but in other Western European countries, that actually, the US is not a reliable ally. That actually having all your eggs in that basket is kind of nonsensical. That actually, whatever you may think about China, and I probably have greater reserves than your other kind of guests. It's what the great thing about it is it's predictable, and there is a stability there. And when they say they want to kind of stand by a kind of rules-based multilateral trading order, I mean, there will be asymmetrical in that, like the Americans were when they said so. But you can expect them to do that. I don't expect China to start kind of levying kind of in quite a capricious way that the Americans have done tariffs. And, there's things to be learned from China. I mean, brutally, as I said in my opening remarks, I mean, its industrial strength is just extraordinary, and it's done it in kind of 30 or 40 years. There are some signs. I mean, President Xi himself has complained that they're not bringing forward enough unicorns. That's high-tech companies worth $1 billion, and that the rate of innovation slightly tailed off, and there are problems there. I think that some things that Britain is beginning to do on science and technology. I mean, 2/5 of the high-tech scale-ups in Europe, 2/5 of the high-tech scale-ups in Europe are British, spinning out of our major universities. And actually, the British government is beginning to get serious about kind of developing some really consequential companies out of that. And China will know that, and will want to keep kind of alongside us as that happens, and be wary that kind of we're anxious to kind of play the same game as they do, and maybe in our own terms, kind of in 10, 15 years' time, no less successful. I expect Britain to grow a £1 trillion tech economy in the next kind of 10 years. That's still smaller than China's, but it's not trivial. So look, it's simultaneously about putting a kind of a marker down, rebalancing, as Steve said, resetting, stabilizing, putting an even keel our relationships with China, being wary, but looking for win-wins where there are some, whilst recognizing that China doesn't share our commitment to pluralism, our commitment to democracy, and all the rest. And it's strange hearing, Donald Trump is a kind of more than imperfect kind of defender of those values, not only in my eyes but in many Americans' eyes. So he can fulminate and shout the odds, but actually he's beginning to get kind of the recoil from the kind of capricious policy and one-sided policies that he's been pursuing the last 12 months, and actually it's well deserved.
Andy, British intelligence services say that China engages in systematic spying. Beijing denies that. How deep is the trust deficit? Can any meaningful economic partnership exist without resolving that?
Well, Adrian, I think that, first of all, charges, I think, are levied back and forth about espionage accusations all around the world. But let me put it this way, to respond to Steve's point that, this trip by Starmer has resulted in limited results and not a strategic realignment, I think, which addresses your question from a slightly different perspective. The question is why? And I think the reason why is that the UK is not really a key member of an alliance, but really is managing an asymmetric relationship with a country that sets the outer boundaries of its strategic autonomy. And I think the UK still remembers the Huawei incident, where US officials flew to London to harangue the then current leadership into reversing its decision about Huawei, despite its own national security establishment saying that these threats are manageable. So I would think about these espionage accusations from a little bit more, with perhaps a little bit of a grain of salt here. But I think the question really then becomes, again, why doesn't the UK have a deeper strategic alignment or realignment with China? And I think, it really is going to have to face this question sooner or later. How does it deal with being a part of the security architecture established by the United States, and, what may be increasingly seen as a prison or a constraint on long-term British prosperity? So I think, this is something that I think China, or at least I would say certain Chinese analysts, recognize this potential. Not that this is going to happen overnight, but China's laying the foundation for a path where the UK, when it chooses to, may move along this path that gives it more strategic autonomy. Now, of course, I think this won't happen overnight. It's not on the radar screen, I think, of most Western analysts, but certainly I think worth bearing in mind.
All right. I want to put the same question to Steve. Given the long-standing allegations of espionage, cyber operations, of political interference, is Britain perhaps being naive, thinking that it can ring-fence security while deepening economic ties with China?
Well, the United Kingdom historically has always been extremely pragmatic when it comes down to international relationships and international engagements. Now, whether you can completely separate your economic trading investment relationship with your national security when the UK is dealing with China is a good question to ask. I don't know the answer to that. I think it is a matter that the government of the day will have to adjust to that. But there is also another basic issue in how the UK is engaging with China, which is that the United Kingdom does not have a long-term China strategy to guide how we engage with China. So our China policies swings between governments, changes in governments, and sometimes even with the same party in power, we can still see the kind of swings that happened, as it indeed happened in the last 10 years under the Conservative Party. The issue with engaging with China and balancing national security with economic interests is always a matter of how you strike that in practice, rather than talk about it in principle. The principle is very easy. Everybody wants to strike that balance. But are we actually getting the balance right? I think that really is the issue. But in terms of the strategic autonomy of the UK, I don't think that is something which China can give us or help us to secure it. It's something that we do it on our own. Let's not forget that Starmer changed the UK's China policy when he became Prime Minister in the summer of 2024, well before Donald Trump secured a second term. So the UK adjustment in its China policy is not simply a result of what Donald Trump has been saying about China or not. We are doing it anyway.
Will, IYY says that the West has lost the moral authority to lecture China on human rights. Is he right? Coming back to this issue of who needs who more in this partnership, does Britain have any credible leverage left on issues like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai?
No, the idea that Britain has got the sufficient economic and military power to persuade President Xi and the Politburo to kind of relax their stance on Jimmy Lai, or kind of the line they're taking in Hong Kong. I mean, it's obvious that we don't. We have to, as Jeremy Hunt, former Foreign Secretary, kind of has said, Tory Foreign Secretary, you have to raise it. The Chinese know you're going to raise it, so you can say that you've raised it, but they're going to not take a blind bit of notice. That is a brute reality of the Chinese are very, very, very kind of brutal and acute in their assessment of what they call kind of total power or total, they look at power holistically, hard power, industrial power, financial power, cultural power, and soft power. And actually, they will recognize that actually through institutions like the BBC, through our cultural institutions, it was interesting that the Royal Shakespeare Company has accompanied the Prime Minister on his trip. And our strength of our universities, they really do admire Oxford and Cambridge. Oxford being the #1 university in the world now, even more important than Harvard or Stanford, and Cambridge kind of co-equal with it, and producing much more intellectually patentable scientific and technological breakthroughs than actually occurring in the United States and importantly in China. And I think that they're building a big embassy here, not because they're philanthropists, but because they recognise that actually the UK, if it gets its act together, could be a source of significant technological power. And so there's a game being played here. We are the weaker partner. We're not going to get any concessions from them along the lines you suggest. But it is, I think it's, in a way, I think as Starmer's attempt to put things on an even keel is a stepping stone to perhaps more.
Look, we're rapidly running out of time. Andy, I just want to come back to what Will was saying there about the game that's being played. Strategically speaking, is China looking for genuine partnership with Britain, or perhaps positioning the UK as this middling power that both Will and Steve have talked about, as perhaps a useful weak link inside the Western alliance?
Well, I think, these are not mutually exclusive goals, Adrian. So I think, of course, China wants a high quality, productive, mutually beneficial relationship with the UK as the UK. I mean, equality is very, very important. We shouldn't look at this only in quantitative metrics, size of population, size of GDP. But again, I think the UK is a cultural superpower. As Will mentioned, enormous contributions to science and technology. It plays a vital role at the United Nations. It's a key part in Europe, although no longer part of the EU. But at the same time, I think that it also recognizes that in order to have a stable, prosperous, sustainable global community of nations, that China has to work with all countries, including the UK, including the United States. Quick point, Adrian, to wrap up.
Very quick.
This framing of needing to protect the UK's national security is anachronistic, because when we look at the foundation of NATO, right, it was to keep the US in, to keep the Germans down and the Russians out. Who is the real national security threat these days in the UK? I would say certainly it's not China.
Okay, all right. I'm sure Steve would have a thing or two to say about that, but and Will too. But we're rapidly running out of time. I've got a minute and a half left. Steve, looking ahead, will Starmer's China visit come to be seen as pragmatic statecraft in a fractured, uncertain world, or as something else, perhaps?
Well, it would be seen as a pragmatic statecraft operation, but it's also one that I think was not anywhere as successful as it's being built out to be. The Prime Minister invests a lot of his personal political capitals in approving the embassy, and he has secured some positive responses from China, put that relationship on a better basis, which is a positive thing, but it is a very modest achievement. And it can easily be derailed if the Chinese government at a later stage found the UK government less useful and helpful, or even just when there is a judicial review being launched against the embassy and held that off for another few years.
Gentlemen, we could have talked for a lot longer about this. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Will Hutton, Andy Mock and Steve Tsang. And thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. You'll find that at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on China, Britain, and everything else we've discussed, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Bye for now.
Don't miss out, get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.